Hi JB, I hope you're doing well. This is my presentation for Law Enforcement Operations, my paper for the class. So I chose to do the long project instead of the three shorter ones, as you know, and my topic ended up being focused on the history of policing, and then specifically going into the history of policing in America. So to kind of establish the background for policing in America, I ended up focusing a lot more on the history of how policing came to be. So I started in ancient times looking at some of the kin policing practicing that was going on with families and friends, and people focusing more on keeping themselves safe through night watches and things like that, rather than the apprehension of criminals. I found it really fascinating when I was looking through stories in ancient Rome and ancient Greece about how intently focused the people were on keeping themselves safe, but they weren't as focused on apprehending the criminals. I specifically remember reading about some of the constables and how they would let crimes occur, especially when a rich person was involved, so that they could be hired as a thief catcher in order to apprehend the criminal and earn a reward from the rich family. And because this was allowed to continue in practice, a lot of poorer families ended up suffering because they couldn't afford bodyguards or retainers or servants like the rich could, and they couldn't afford to hire the constables to try and apprehend the criminals or to regain their property because they simply couldn't afford to do it. So policing in like 6 AD through the 1200s ended up being very biased in favor of the rich because people were not being paid to police. Because people weren't being paid to police, they didn't have motivation to actually engage in active policing activities, which ended up being a huge problem. When Sir Henry Fielding and Sir Robert Peel came along, they began a reform of policing, and that really helped a lot of people. Sir Robert Peel ended up setting forth a lot of principles, along with a couple other gentlemen, known as the Peelian principles, that helped establish a lot of policing in specifically the London area, and then it expanded to include America as time went along. So in my research for this project, I ended up spending a lot more time focusing on the ancient history of policing and how it came to be than I did on the American side of history as I originally intended. However, I was able to turn and look more into American history of policing as I delved further into my paper. After Robert Peel's principles were introduced, I was able to look into the history of American policing from roughly the 1600s to the 1800s, and I found that it actually reflected on the ancient systems a lot. America, when the colonists first came over, put forth a great deal of their effort into maintaining night watches and constableships, and there was still a lot of voluntary policing going on because people couldn't afford to pay the police officers, so it was very much a voluntary position, but it was less voluntary than it was voluntold. The men really didn't want to be doing this position, but they had to because they didn't have another choice. As time went on, sheriffs and marshals were hired, and we developed what became the Old West of policing, and vigilante justice became a huge deal because sheriffs ended up focusing more on taxes and investigating cattle brands and things like that instead of actually apprehending criminals. So it once again went back to the men of the town to committee together and chase after criminals. Unfortunately, this ended up in justice being served a lot less often than it is nowadays because these men would often impulsively kill the people that they were hunting without worrying about court systems or anything like that. I found it really interesting how both different and similar these historical systems were to the modern system we have today. Because today we still value night watches and day patrols on policemen. We really value having police presence in the community. But instead of making it a voluntary position, we've expanded it to become a legitimate career option for both men and women who aspire to these positions. And policing has become a great deal more effective today than it ever was in the past because of a newfound appreciation for the apprehension of criminals as well as a stronger focus on the protection of citizens. Thank you.